Today we're going to take a quick crash course in typography. Now, typography is a deep subject, and this can only scratch the surface. You can take whole courses, multiple courses in typography, and above all, typography takes a lot of practice to learn it and get it right and get all the details. But we're going to take a quick dive so that you know what the basics are. So let's get started. So the first thing to know is the basic anatomy and classifications of type. Now, the basic thing is to know the broad categories of type and understand them. So the first thing to be aware of is what we call a serif typeface, such as you'll see in the upper right hand here. Now, serif typefaces have the little feet at the bottom, and they'll have little flags or hooks at the tops of the letter forms. Those are what we call serifs. Now, sans serif means without serifs, and sans serifs don't have those little feet or those little flags. They're generally much simpler letter forms. And even though sans serifs have been around for a while, we generally perceive them as being more modern, more contemporary. We also have slab serif. So slab serif is sort of a subtype of serif, and slab serifs basically have serifs. They have those little feet and those little flags, but they're chunky and squared off, like big slabs. And those are three of the most common types, classifications of letter forms at their broadest level. If you look at this diagram on the left here, you can see that we can dig in deeper and look at the anatomy of the letters themselves. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but I want you to notice that we have these three lines. We have the baseline, which is the line that all the letters sit on top of. We have the cap height, which is the height of capital letters. It's the top, basically, of the line. And then in the middle, you see that dotted line there, which we call the X height. It's called the X height because it's the height of a lowercase letter x. And how high that X height is between the baseline and the cap height determines a lot about the feel and flavor of the typeface. We can also look at some of the individual parts of the letters, such as look at on that letter K, there's the ascender, which is the part of the lowercase letter that sticks up above the X height line, all the way up to the cap height. On that lowercase y, you'll see the descender, which is the part of the lowercase letter that hangs down below the baseline. Another important thing to know is to understand weights versus styles. When we talk about weights of typeface, we're talking about how bold or how light something is. We're talking about the thickness of the letter forms. We're generally mostly familiar with bold and normal weights, but some typefaces will have a bunch of different weights. They'll have super light weights. They can have bolder than bold, sometimes called extra bold or black or heavy weights, and there can be a whole spectrum in between there. Styles simply refers to whether something is regular or italic. In this context, another word for the regular type is Roman. So we can say italic versus Roman. And that's where the letter forms have been designed to have a little bit more of a calligraphic quality to them. They typically have a little bit of a slope to them and sometimes can have other differentiation as well. One of the biggest things to consider when it comes to type and doing typography is how to choose typefaces. Your choice of typefaces is going to make a huge impact on the feel and the style. So let's take a look at some of the different types of typefaces. First, there's body type or body copy or body typefaces. If we're going to be reading longer blocks of text, we want it to be as easy for the reader to see what the words are, make out the letter shapes. We want it to be readable and legible. So readable means that we can read it as a whole. Legible means that the individual letter forms are easy to make out. And so we want to choose typefaces that have a lot of legibility and a lot of readability and are relatively simple. There are some typefaces that are much more complex, decorative, fancy, fun, and these should not be used for body type. That doesn't mean they should never be used, we call these display typefaces. They have a lot of flavor and personality, so it's okay to use them, but you should only use them for things like headings, large text, accents. You don't want to use a lot of them, and you don't want to use them at small sizes just because they can be hard to read. Those are display typefaces. So the other thing, and maybe the biggest thing to think about as you're choosing typefaces, is what does a typeface communicate just in the shapes of the letters, just in the design, not what the words say, but what the choice of typeface itself says. Here we can see we've got a fancy typeface, and that calligraphic scripty quality really makes it feel fancy. We've got one that feels very modern and clean. We've got one that feels very sort of conservative and old school. We've got one that's very impactful and kind of punches you in the face. And it's the form of the letters themselves that are communicating those things. So when you are choosing type for a project, it's really important to think, what is the feel I'm going for? What do I want readers or users to experience? And then choose your typeface based on what's appropriate for that. Now, we talked about readability and how important that is, especially for body copy. Let's dig into some of the things that can help with readability. The first thing is line length, also known as measure. So if the lines of text are really long, your eye has to find its way from the end of one line all the way back to the beginning of the next line. And if that distance is too long, your eye has a long time to get lost. Now, I think most of us are kind of familiar with the line length that you see in a Word document, since we all probably grew up using Word documents to do our typing. But that's actually too long. It's not a very good line length. In general, it's considered to be between 45 and 75 characters in length, or letters in length is a good length for a line. And again, that's just a rule of thumb. It's not always going to be right for every project. Sometimes it can be shorter, sometimes it can be longer. The one kind of thing I like to bear in mind is about the width of a line in a hand-sized paperback novel, standard paperback novel. That's about the right line length for easy reading. And that's just so important. You don't want the eye to get lost. The next thing is leading, also known as line height. Leading is the amount of space between the lines of text. Leading is one of those things that you can go too far in either direction. You don't want too much leading or too much space between the lines because, again, your eye can have difficulty jumping from one line to the next and not getting lost along the way. But you also don't want it to be too tight with the lines too close together because it makes everything feel crowded and uncomfortable. So there's a Goldilocks principle here. We want to get it just right, just in the middle. Again, a good rule of thumb for body copy is to start at around 1.5 times the size of the type. So if your type is, let's say, 16 pixels, 1.5 times that would be 21 pixels. So that's a good starting place. Just a rule of thumb. It's going to be different for every typeface and every scenario, so you've got to trust your eyes. But that's a really good place to start. The next one that I can't emphasize enough is color contrast. You don't want the text to be too similar in shade to the background that it's hard to read. We can see here this yellow text. It doesn't stand out from the background enough. That's hard to read. And the light gray text is also just not different enough from the background. Now, when it comes to color, it's important to realize that what really matters is shade, or how light or how dark it is. It doesn't matter what color it is quite as much, or hue. So if we have two completely different colors, let's say red and blue, and you put red text on a blue background, well, whether or not that's going to work is going to depend on whether the lightness or the shade is different enough, even though the two colors are very different. Another thing that I like to think about is that pure white background and pure black text, or vice versa, pure black background and pure white text, a lot of times that amount of contrast tends to be a little harsh. That's as much contrast as you can possibly have, and it's just a little exhausting on the eye. So a lot of times making the background just a little off-white or making the text just a little off-black will make it a little gentler and a little easier to read. And this stuff is all the more important for thinking about users who may have visual impairments, whether that just be having a slight myopia or being a little hard of seeing, or it might be color blindness. Thinking about color contrast of your text is really, really important to make sure those users don't get left out. Now, hierarchy. Let's talk about type and hierarchy. Hierarchy is giving a visual indication of what's important and what the relationship between the different parts of the type are. And that's so much of what design is showing importance, showing relationship. So let's look at some of the ways we can do that. We can have nothing but line breaks. And then we've got what's called flat hierarchy. Nothing really looks different from anything else. Here, because of the line break, you can kind of see the title and the date are different from the paragraph, but nothing about the type helps you see that they actually are playing different roles. A simple thing we can do is just use spacing. Add a little bit of white space between those two things, and automatically the mind starts to separate them. This is that good old-fashioned Gestalt principle of proximity. Because these things are farther away from each other, the brain interprets them as being different from each other. And that's one of the simplest things you can do. You can also get a lot more fancy with spacing. Put things to the side, arrange them in two-dimensional space and more than just the obvious up and down axis. And you can, again, establish a lot with just using that space. The next thing we can do is use weight. Remember, we talked earlier about weight being the thickness of the letters and whether something is bold or regular or extra bold or whatever. And here you can see the title really stands out because it's the only thing on the page that's bold. So that works really well. Another thing is using color. Basically, the eye perceives anything that is different as standing on its own in some kind of way. So here, because the title is the only thing that's in that maroon color, the eye perceives it as having more importance. And because the lighter gray has been used for the date, the eye perceives it as having less importance. Another thing you can do, and this is the one everyone always wants to go to right away, is use size. And that can be very successful to show importance. Obviously, we kind of think bigger is more important in general, but it's not the only way to do things. But creating a series of sizes that you use can be very effective. Another one is using style. Remember earlier we said that style refers to italicis versus Roman or regular letter forms. And here, again, the thing that's different, the thing that's italic, the eye perceives that as having added importance because it's different. Another thing we can do is use a different typeface. I generally say that in most projects, you never need more than 2 different typefaces. Usually you can create sort of a main typeface that's going to hold your body copy, and then an accent typeface that will do things like this, where the title and the date are offset because they have a different typeface. And again, the eye perceives the thing that's different as having added importance. We can also use decoration, which is put lines, dots, shapes, background colors, and if you put them near or behind or on top of certain bits of text, the eye is going to perceive that text as being associated with that decoration, and the added decoration will add a sense of importance to that text. So that can also be just super effective at creating that sense of difference that's going to create hierarchy. Now, we looked at all these individual different methods, but you can combine these methods together. Here you can see we've got some complex spacing going on. We've got some different colors because the date is that lighter gray. We've got some weight differences. We've got typeface differences. We've got decoration. We've got almost all the things that we talked about here. We've got size differences between the different parts of the type. And it really creates a strong sense of the differences and the roles between the different parts of the type. But it's important to remember you don't have to use every method all the time. Sometimes just using one or a combination of a couple of methods can be totally effective and all that you need. You don't have to throw the kitchen sink at it all the time. And I am really a big proponent of Dieter Rams's principle that good design is often as little design as possible. Keep it simple. Another thing to think about is the idea of typographic scales. Basically, a typographic scale is a set of sizes that you're going to use throughout your design so that you have cohesion and you're not just choosing a random type size for every individual piece of the design. You're reusing the same type sizes over and over again. You may notice that in most of your typical writing software like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, when you go to choose a type size, it offers a bunch of numbers to you. Usually you see like 12 points, 14 points, 18 points, 21 points, and those may seem kind of random, but that is a very common typographic scale where that set of sizes is designed to look good together and be reused over and over again. So you're going to get more consistency, more understandability through your design by using the same type sizes over and over again instead of just making it up for each individual piece of type. So that is our typography crash course. As I said, it really is super introductory, super surface level, but it gets most of the core principles and ideas across. So I really encourage you to study more about typography, read as much as you can, start to notice the typography that you encounter in your daily life, whether that be on the internet or signage out in the world, books, magazines, newspapers. There's type everywhere. And once you start to pay attention to it, you can get a sense of how that type is being used. A simple question to ask yourself when you're looking at type anywhere is, what does that typeface communicate non-verbally? What emotion do I get from that typeface? And why did the designer choose that typeface? Starting to think about that kind of thing will set you on a path to become very knowledgeable in the world of typography.